Welcome to the S.O.A.P Bible Study Series from Oak Tree Community Church in South Bend, Indiana. We're working our way through the book of 2 Kings, and we are almost to the end. We have just a couple of weeks left here.
So the kind of the cool thing is we are finally into the Kings.
Yeah.
It took us a while, right? We kind of started with prophets and went down the road with them, and now last week we really got into Kings.
Yeah, we really got into the Kings.
It was a little
long. A lot of them.
Exactly. So we have seen 19 kings for Israel that God didn't want any of them to do with.
Yeah, they're all bad.
Yeah, but the whole idea is the nation of Israel split into two, northern and southern kingdom, and you know, you got to know that by now.
Yeah.
But the idea, we've said that there's going to be 20 kings on each side, and we are on number 19 on the northern side. So
which means that we should be coming to
something bad is going to happen in the first chapter.
Yeah,
but they had to split. Right? From the standpoint of, if you are splitting as part of a civil war, not only did they have to split, but they had to split away from David.
Yeah.
And the reason they did is because Judah, the line that David came from, stayed behind.
Yeah.
So they had to make up everything as they went along, and it showed in their kings.
As far as their worship, as far as what they decided to obey with the law and didn't obey.
That's pretty much everything.
Yeah, right?
Everything, yeah.
Right,
yeah.
So Israel, none of the kings were from the Davidic line.
Yep.
Right? So that's why we would have assassinations and this family and that family. And it was, it was almost mob rule up there.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it really was. And so we have a new king, Hosea. He becomes king over Israel, and he was evil, but not as bad as the guys before him. So that's kind of a win.
And that's the best you can say about some of these guys.
It is. But he also had a huge problem because the Assyrian king came rolling up with his army. Israel didn't even come close to standing a chance. So this guy, he actually did something kind of cool. He said, wait, in return for safe passage, I will become a servant of you. This is the king saying this, and we will pay tribute to you. And it was agreed upon. So that's the way it was going until it seemed that Hosea was playing both sides of it.
Yeah.
Because he also went to Egypt and tried to cut a deal with them to help out. So the Assyrian king figured that out, and because he figured out that Egypt was being talked to, and also he wasn't receiving any money, which is probably a pretty big thing.
Yeah.
So they attacked.
Yeah.
And they marched through the whole land, and they besieged Samaria, the north. I take that to be the northern part of the kingdom.
Well, that's the capital.
Oh,
so
okay.
Samaria would be the capital of
versus
Israel.
the area.
Yeah.
Right. So for 3 years. And then they started deporting people to Assyria too.
Yep.
And this was around 722 BC. And the reason I'm saying that is because that happened first, but then there was also second waves that went on too. Another attack that happened, and the rest of the people were taken.
Yeah, in Judah.
Right. Yeah. Well, no, I meant up north, right? Everybody didn't seem like everybody went at once.
So last time we saw sort of like an early attack, and some were done.
Okay.
This
one
is the second big one. This is the second batch, and this is really the big one, 722,
then.
where the northern kingdom is now fallen and does not exist anymore.
So from a serious standpoint, it's kind of cool. We're going to take everybody where they're at. We're going to move them over to our home where we can keep an eye on them. And we're going to take people that probably don't have much, transplant them here. They're going to be good Assyrian nationality.
Yeah.
And everything will work perfect.
Yeah, other captives, other things, places that they've taken, and a lot of Assyrians that they moved in. What that would cause then was interbreeding with the locals, the Jews that were left, the Israelites that were left. Because frankly, we don't want everybody. And we're going to leave the lowest class and the worst of the worst type thing, and basically just breed you out of existence was the idea. Mm-hmm. This is where, because you mentioned Samaria, this is where by Jesus' time the Samaritans had come from. It was this interbreeding.
This cross.
Yeah. So the fact
which is
that
why they were hated.
They were hated because they were a constant reminder of this Assyrian attack and oppression.
Yeah, but I was, in my mind, the big question is, how could God let this happen? And it's obviously the wrong question. Maybe a better one is, why didn't he do this earlier?
Yeah, right.
But this is the same God that warned these people for centuries.
Yeah.
This was going to happen.
Yeah.
Even at the time of Moses, there was a warning. And even if you go all the way back to Abraham, when he was talking to Abraham about, hey, you're going to be the father of this great nation. By the way, we're going to have a little trouble at one point in time. It'll get fixed. But even at the time of Abraham, God knew that this was going to happen.
Well, and you mentioned the prophets, Elijah, Elisha, and there are a lot of other prophets that either aren't not named or we just don't know a lot about throughout here. But since you mentioned the date 722, let me just make a parallel or just a connection here. Solomon died in 931. So from the time that the kingdom split until now has been more than 200 years that they've been playing this game.
And of constant bad leadership.
Right. So it's not just like 20 kings, over the past, 50 years or whatever. This has been 200 years.
Yeah.
That God has been warning them. And we've talked about Isaiah, we've talked about Jonah, we've talked about Elijah and Elisha and so many others. And they're not listening. Right. So I think God has been,
more than kind,
more than gracious in letting them go.
So basically, around verse 7 till close to the end of chapter 18, there's one more part in here. Is the writer's reasoning on why God allowed this to happen?
Yeah, it's like a summary.
Yeah, it's a good question, but there are some valid reasons.
So I made 3 notes here in chapter 17. Yep. Verse 9 says that the Israelites said things about the Lord their God that were not right. Now, the Hebrew text is a little bit difficult there. Some translations are going to say they did things in secret or whatever, but the idea being that they presented something, they presented falsehood as if it were true. God approved their idolatry or whatever, right? Verse 15, they paid allegiance to worthless idols and so became worthless to the Lord. There's a play on words there with vanity, and they were vain, and So for God to say you're worthless,
right?
That's pretty bad, right?
Yeah, pretty bad.
And then verse 23, Israel rather. First of all, finally the Lord rejected Israel just as He had warned, which is what we've been talking about through the servants, the prophets. Israel was deported from its land to Assyria and remains there to this very day, which is interesting because that's not today. Sometimes we read to this very day. It's like, 2024. No, from the time that this was written, which means we can place the writing of this. We know what the end of 2 Kings is eventually, spoilers, Judah's going to get taken as well 100 years later, 125 years later. But when this was written, it was still before the returns. Right? So we can place the writing of 2 Kings roughly after Judah collapses, but during the 70-year exile.
Right. Okay. All right. So we're at the point where all the Israelites, the northern tribe, are out of Israel and in Assyria, and Assyrians have replaced them. So now what God does is God sends lions in.
I love that.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So God brought in lions to actually kill the people until a Jewish priest shows up.
Because what they've done is they've brought back all of their idolatry and all this stuff in, and so God says, this is still my land, which I think is something that we forget sometimes. This is not Israel's land. Yep. It's God's land that He's letting them have or use, right? So they are still violating all the stuff on God's land, so He's like, take you out too.
And the Jewish priest doesn't tell them how to get away from the lions. It's about God. Yeah. Right? Like you were talking, which is a really interesting point. Yeah. So then, of course, they started worshiping our God and their gods.
Along with all the rest of them.
Right. Yeah. So obviously it didn't work.
Yeah.
Okay, so now in chapter 18, we start talking about kings, and all these kings are going to be only kings that are in Judah.
This is the southern kingdom, right?
Yep, so Hezekiah becomes king at age 25. He's going to reign for 29 years. We got to work our way to 125 years, right? He did what the Lord approved, and he got rid of the high places. I mean, this is a high point.
This is so.
At least for the first half of his reign.
Well, and that's number one, because most people don't think of Hezekiah being bad, but his second half was not as good. But he is likened to David, and verse 5 says that he trusted in the Lord God of Israel, and in this regard there was none like him among the kings of Judah, either before or after. So he was the best king for the first half anyway. He was the best king since David. Right. As far as loyalty to God. That's saying a lot.
Yeah. So he was successful in all of his endeavors, and he rebelled against Assyria and defeated the Philistines.
Yeah.
So in the 14th year of his reign, Assyria marched into Judah and captured him.
And the name Sennacherib, for you history buffs out there, is going to show up here, so you might find that interesting.
Okay, we're just
just as a king of Assyria, is Sennacherib. Yep. Because if you're a history buff, he's sort of a famous name.
Right. So Hezekiah writes a letter to the king saying, "Look, I violated our treaty. If you leave, I'll do what you demand." And they of course said, "Yeah, of course we will, and you also pay this much." Yeah. So it was 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. And they didn't have enough money, or didn't seem to have enough money. Hezekiah had him strip the metal from the doors of the temple.
And it's interesting because in verse 15, Hezekiah gave him all the silver in the Lord's temple and in the treasuries, which sounds odd because wasn't gold so plentiful?
Right.
Well, they've been attacked enough times that the last time this happened, they handed over all the gold. Now he doesn't have a lot of gold left, so now he's handing over the silver. So we're seeing the downfall even of Judah here.
Bronze going to be soon.
Yeah. It used to be that they didn't count the bronze at all. Now they're going to be looking at their pennies.
Shekels.
Yeah.
All right, so the king of Assyria also sent a commanding general and some advisors, and they wanted to talk to King Hezekiah's representatives in Jerusalem. So they're in Jerusalem, standing around the upper pool, and Assyria was trying to figure out, what are you doing, Judah?
Yeah.
You cannot win.
Yeah, there's no way you
There's
can
no
beat
way
us.
you win. We're going to crush you. How do you think you have a chance? And in fact, Hezekiah was asked, in whom are you trusting that you would dare rebel against me?
Yeah.
That was like, would you ask him that?
Yeah.
On what are you doing? And basically what they're saying is, your God wasn't big enough.
Well, first they say, if you're counting on Egypt, they can't help you.
Right.
And if you're counting on your God, listen, I heard what you did. King Hezekiah knocked down all of the extra worship places and is making you worship just in this one place in Jerusalem. There's no way your God can like that.
Yeah.
Obviously not understanding.
Right. Well, and then they were saying, look, to the people, don't listen to Hezekiah, what he's saying. The Lord will rescue us, because no God has rescued anybody from Assyria. And the Jewish nation was quiet, and I love this part. The Jewish nation was quiet because the king had told them not to respond.
Yeah.
So there was enough discussion beforehand. Everybody was in agreement. Our God is the way to go. We're going to stand by it.
Yep.
We know we're going to be asked. We know we're going to be tasked. Just don't let it bother you.
Two things that one thing this reminds me of, and then one thing that I think is fun because it's a language thing. One thing this reminds me of is this Sennacherib sounds an awful lot like Pharaoh in the past, right? Who's your God? Who's telling me to let your people go? Sounds like Nebuchadnezzar in the future. And what God can deliver you from the lions or from the fiery furnace or from So there's this same attitude of all of these world leaders standing against God. I mean, it's the same story. Only the names are changed to protect the guilty type thing, right? Number two, there's this funny little thing in here, and as a language guy, I like this because in verse 26. Hezekiah's advisors talk to Sennacherib's messenger and says, hey, listen, we understand Aramaic, which is your language, the Gentile language. It's similar to Hebrew. but they're not exactly the same. Listen, let's talk in Aramaic, because we don't want all of the people hearing what you have to say. And they were speaking in Hebrew, which means everybody could hear it.
Yeah.
And Sennacherib's messengers are like, no, we want everyone to hear this. We're going to speak in your language. We're going to, and so they're going, no, let's talk in your language. So there's this funny little interaction there that's going on. During the exile, this is why Aramaic then became the common language of the Jewish people, because they went to those lands, they learned Aramaic, and they brought it back. A good chunk of Daniel's written in Aramaic, a part of Ezra's written in Aramaic in the Old Testament, because they are dealing with Gentiles in the Gentile lands. So there's this funny little interchange here. Oh, no, let's speak in a different language here, and no, we're gonna
get it out to everybody.
Yeah.
So Hezekiah wasn't present there, right? You're never present, right? You got to send your representatives. So the representatives are talking to Hezekiah about what went down, and Hezekiah is distraught, right? He tears his clothes and he goes to the Lord's temple. Mm-hmm. Now, I think that is an awesome sign for probably at least 17 chapters. Nobody has gone to the temple, right? So Isaiah was also there, and they asked Isaiah if God would help them against Assyria, and they said, hey, don't take it from us. Just review what the general said. God should punish him for what the general said. Mm-hmm. And then God said through Isaiah, look, I'll take care of it.
Yeah.
I'll control his mind. I'll cut him off, and I'll cut him down in his own land. And then Hezekiah was also campaigning. He has a lot going on here. The king of Ethiopia came to fight. Mm-hmm. So, not only do you have the big nation, outside your door, now you have somebody else coming in too.
And you also, if you're from a geographical standpoint, Assyria is coming from the north, Ethiopia is coming from the south. Right. So, literally,
you're going to have to make a deal with somebody.
Yeah.
Right. And the king of Ethiopia sent a letter to Hezekiah saying, hey, don't let your God mislead you. Syria's, annihilated everybody. There's no way you can stand up against those guys.
Yep.
Do you really think you're going to be rescued? And Hezekiah takes this letter to the Lord's temple, and he prays to God.
Yep.
And
it says it lays out the letter in front of him. Yeah.
Right. It is a great prayer, right? Yep. He is praising God for his greatness. It doesn't seem like this is the first time he's gone before God to do a prayer. So, he is thanking God for what he's done in the past, what he will do in the future, and he's asking to be rescued from Assyria. So the world knows that the God of Israel is the only God.
And I think this is I think this is a great verse 19, chapter 19, verse 19 is a great connection to David. Remember, we're told that there was nobody like him, except for, since David. And if you think of the Psalms, one of the big things that you find in the Psalms is David, when he's asking for God to destroy his enemies, it's not just to rescue him, it's to preserve his reputation among the nations, right? Hezekiah is doing the exact same thing here. So I think there's a subtle connection there as well.
And we'll see next week, God responds that way too.
Yeah, he does. And that's
but we end on a cliffhanger right now.
Yeah, but it's this is like one of the best endings we've had in this whole book. I mean, we haven't been smiling.
There's hope.
There's hope, right? Yeah, so it's sort of bittersweet because Israel's out.
Right.
But Judah seems to be hanging on. So, and Hezekiah's doing well so far. So
he is
holding out hope that we might actually have a good king.
Good.
So
we'll see next week.
We'll see. Yeah, we still have a little bit left to go here in 2 Kings before we finish. But right now, it's looking good for Judah. So Hezekiah, definitely one of the good kings, and so glad to be in the middle of this story with him. Hopefully you find these things interesting, and as you read through it, you find some encouragement here, even in the middle of some dark days for Israel and Judah. But God is a promise-keeping God, and so we can trust that. And hopefully that's encouraging for whatever you're going through as well. So share this with your friends and family who you think need to hear that same message. And we'll be back here next time and pick right up here and hear what God has to say to Hezekiah.
Bye, everybody.